Obtaining the base mesh. In this chapter, we will show how we approach the creation of the Enfield Revolver base mesh. Since our time is limited, we will show a selection of the most important steps rather than a full uncut time-lapse, which would take hours. The first step is dragging our image references into Blender. By default, images are seen from both sides, so we can go into the Images Preferences tab and disable this by clicking on Side Front. We then need to determine the object's true scale. We take the size data we found online and make some boxes with those measurements by simply putting in the values in the Dimensions panel. We then scale the reference image to reflect this correct size. It's best to use as many dimensions as we can to average the references instead of relying on a single one. We will need references from both sides of the weapon, since they are not symmetrical. It will also help us to have blueprints, if we found any, as well as photo references to aid with modeling the internals. Next, we do the same with the cartridge, whose dimensions are perfectly defined because they are public knowledge. This means we can be 100% sure the cartridge size is accurate, so it will become a scale reference for the rest of the gun's pieces. To begin showcasing procedural modeling, we start by recreating the bullet. We add a screw modifier that spins a single edge strip and configure it to follow the bullet's axis. We then match the mesh to the reference by adding vertices to the edge strip. The screw modifier will need to be configured so the final mesh looks correct. In this case, we need to check the Calculate Order and Flip buttons, and also turn on Auto Smooth to fix the shading. We also check Merge Vertices and reduce the default value so it does not merge our whole mesh. To center our bullet to the scene's axis, we first set the origin to the center of the bullet's back face, and then zero its location on the end panel. We will also have to move the image reference, which is off-center now. We begin modeling the revolver by syncing it up with the bullet's well-defined scale. In particular, the bullet diameter, which will serve as a starting point for our barrel. Once we define the hollow part of the barrel where the bullet will be fired from, we model the rest of it, starting with a box since its outside shape is very planar. Our very first boolean will be the curve below the barrel that defines its main shape. We want to keep the operation simple and easily editable, so we just keep a couple faces and make use of the bevel and solidify modifiers. We match the curve to the reference and then remove the extra volume from the base mesh. We can't just make the boolean bigger, because the solidify modifier can't be elongated more than a certain amount before starting to result in errors. Of course, we could just collapse the modifier and make the boolean bigger. These decisions are arbitrary, because the end result will be the same. We apply the first booleans and instantly notice a problem. As you can see, the bottom curve does not match the object perfectly. This shape is a bit more complex than simply a flat cut. It's rounded on the bottom. To solve this, we just add a middle loop and push it along the face's normals with Alt-S. Then, to fix the initial bevel, we create a second bevel modifier that is limited by angle instead of weight. Our next boolean will carve out the cuts from the top of the barrel. In this workflow, we have to use mirror on the booleans themselves. We can't boolean stuff into a non-watertight half mesh and then mirror it, because then the booleans will fail. To drive the mesh's curves, we again add a bevel modifier and some bevel weights. Same process with the curved shape on top of the barrel, which generates the front side mount. Continuing the modeling process, we turn one of the booleans into planes and add a solidify modifier. The aim now is to bend and bevel the boolean towards the back to match the reference's shape. After yet another curvy boolean, the back part of the barrel must be defined a bit more. Most of the modeling process with this method is a balance between modeled and boolean shapes, whatever is faster and easier. Now it's time for the bottom of the piece, where a hinge provides the necessary opening to allow for a quick reload from the back of the cylinder. Nailing the location of the center of this boolean is extremely important, because it will become a main animation point from which the curves and radiuses of many other pieces will flow. Not only we need to carve out this cylinder, but also two thinner extra ones that will become part of this hinge mechanism. One of the most complex booleans of this piece is the one connecting the back of the barrel tube to the bullet chamber inside the cylinder. We will not only need a cylinder generated with a screw modifier, but also a secondary boolean to limit the area of effect of this main one. This secondary boolean will just be a boxy mesh that follows the shape of the reference, and will be subtracted to the cylinder boolean. We then set up another negative cylindrical boolean. This one generates the tube that will house the cylinder axis, so again, its position must be chosen well. Of course though, this being a live boolean workflow, we can always adjust it later. The front side, on the other hand, is just box modeled. Its curves are controlled with bevel weights to keep things non-destructive. In our last step before moving to the cylinder, we model the connection point of the barrel and the frame, where the barrel latch will rest, and then cut a hole in the middle of it where the top of the frame will fit in. Next, we start up with the cylinder. We will follow more or less the same process: create a cylinder, position it in the correct rotation axis, and turn it into a live object using the screw modifier. Its first booleans will be the 6 bullet chambers, whose size we obtain from the bullet itself. We make a copy of it, take the necessary surfaces, and turn them into subtraction operands. To help us create all of the radial arrays that would conform the shape of the cylinder, we create a reference point in the cylinder axis, something that we can easily select to establish the pivots of our meshes. Then, we create another one in the bullet's axis, which is the same one as the chamber and barrel. This MT will be used as a pivot for the screw modifier, since we will need to change the Boolean's pivot to that of the main cylinder to generate the radial array. Then, we create the chambers array using the Interactive Tools add-on. The array generation is controlled via gestures. We drag the cursor to modify the number of elements in the array, and then we drag holding Control to change the rotation axis. Finally, we apply the Boolean. Now, if we need to modify the bullet chambers, we can easily do so by editing the main one. The second main Boolean of the cylinder are its grooves, which give it its most representative outer shape. Like many of the ones we came before, it begins with two faces with a bevel in the middle, which are then solidified. Of course, the shape of these grooves is not flat, but curved, so we will have to add a second bevel modifier to execute this curve. This becomes a problem when Solidify does not allow us to get the necessary depth to achieve this curvature, so we end up collapsing the modifier and turning the planes back into a static mesh. The bevels look correct now, so after adding a weld modifier to fix the middle edges, we can move our operand to its position along the cylinder. Then we will apply the Boolean, which we will tweak and match using the references. Finally, we apply a radial array to obtain the 5 other cylinder grooves. This next operand, a variable-sized bevel at the front of the cylinder, is one of the most difficult ones. The shape is repeated 6 times, along with the chambers and grooves of the cylinder, so we use the screw modifier to set up 1/6 of the perimeter of the circle, 60 degrees. We will later complete the circle with another radial array that we will later weld. We set up a lattice object to control the deformation of this cylinder sector by creating a center loop in the lattice and dragging it to the side. The base cylinder shape being mostly done, we focus on its smaller details, like the little holes that lock it in place when each of the chambers is aligned to the barrel. Same deal with the other holes that allow this locking mechanism to slide and rotate towards the right side. Now for the bullet extractor. This piece, embedded in the cylinder, ejects the spent bullet casings when reloading. We can apply the same bullet chamber operand that we subtracted from the main cylinder. Do not duplicate Boolean objects if it's not strictly necessary. The complexity of the scene will be lower, and it will perform much better. A very complex small piece of the extractor is the pusher. This is the piece that will actually rotate the cylinder 60 degrees when the hammer moves back. It will follow the same shape logic as the rest of the cylinder. Whatever shape we want to carve out of it will have to form a radial array. We identify two main shapes that, subtracted to the base one, give us the final shape of the pusher. After a lot of tweaking, we obtain the piece. On to the next piece, the revolver's frame. This is a complex part whose base we can't really model in a non-destructive way. Most of its outer perimeter is curved, so it's not a great idea to obtain those curves with bevels or booleans. It will be difficult to match them. Instead, we just follow the perimeter with a string of vertices, and then connect them together to form a kind of 2D blueprint of the piece. With a mirror modifier, we establish the width of the piece and apply crease to its borders. We will refine this shape using a subdivision modifier, so we need these creases to define its hard borders. We then extrude the edges into the origin plane to form the frame's volume. Even after subdividing, something is missing. The borders of this piece are not flat, but curved. An easy way to obtain these curves is simply to push the middle loop outwards with Alt-S. This distance will be the one that defines the curvature of this piece. We leave the middle loop uncreased to make this subdivision very soft, and apply support loops to the straight parts that need them. Now that the subdivision is set up, we go back to the base mesh and finally adjust the curves to match the reference. We then model the first Boolean operand of the frame, two cuts that make the trigger guard thinner than the rest of the frame. These are easily achieved with two beveled boxes. To keep with the width of the cut more or less even, we have to modify the base mesh a bit to adapt it to the new booleans. This is the end result of the tweaking. We now cut away the part of the frame that will fit the hand grips. After a failed attempt to recreate the shape with a bevel modifier, we go back to creasing and subdividing the surface, which gives us way more control over the curves, sacrificing a little bit of editability. With this method, we can't control the exact number of divisions of a curve, just the level of subdivision. Nonetheless, it's a very simple cut, so we don't care about this so much. Using the edges of the base mesh as control points of the curve, we match the shape perfectly to the reference. Moving on to the barrel latch, here are the booleans we will use to model the rear sight. As we discussed in the previous lesson, this is an important shape that will drive the sight picture of the weapon when aiming down the sights. The first boolean is a box with a thickness about the same as the front sight. The second one is a screw cylinder that forms the curved shape in front. After more closely looking at the reference, we see that their proportions are a bit off, so we adjust the box and the cylinder to better match them. To finish the latch, we again use crease and subdivision on the base piece. Its curves are a bit too complex for simple bevels. Moving on, we model the first of the grip variants, the pre-war wooden grip. We start by duplicating the frame geometry, whose shape it closely follows. always try to save time by using the pieces you already have as a base. In this case, we just subdivide a tube made from the original frame to obtain the base shape for the grip, adjusting its left and right sides to match them in their connection point. A great time saver for this piece is using the original boolean that carves a hole in the frame as an intersection boolean for our grip. Those two pieces are supposed to fit in, so this is a win-win for us. Thanks to it, we eliminate the middle part of the grip and cut away the extra volume on top. Now, we just need to adjust the bottom of the grip to the frame, which we achieve with a couple more booleans. Using the wooden grip as a base, we execute the polymer one from World War II, which is wider and blockier. Even though it matches the exact same frame, this grip has a way bigger top, so we need to adjust the base shape a bit. We then edit the subdivision mesh to match the reference, using the booleans to impose constraints on the piece's borders. The bottom part of the grip is just modeled with sub-D, since it is way softer than in the previous grip. The thumb rest is carved out using a subdivided plane boolean with Solidify. We need full control over these curves, since they are kind of arbitrary and don't really follow a geometrical pattern. Instead, they follow ergonomic reasons. They were added so it was easier to control the gun during double action fire. As for the trigger, the first step is establishing its point of rotation, from which the diameter of its back curve can be obtained. If this circle sector matches the rotation, the curve will appear static when the trigger moves back and forth. To model the actual trigger, we follow the same procedure as with the frame. First, we create a 2D blueprint in mesh form that will be subdivided with crease to control its curves. Notice that I use transformation gizmos when doing this. The reason is speed. When working on a single 2D plane, mouse gestures are more trouble than they are worth, and it's simply faster to temporarily activate the gizmo. The rest of the trigger is built following the same principle. We apply crease and then adjust the piece to fit the proportions of the frame. Finally, we decide to replace one of the creases with a bevel modifier, because the front of the trigger is a little bit rounder than the rest of the edges. We now skip several unimportant small pieces and jump to the frame's side plate. This is a special piece, because the best way to obtain it is as part of another one, in this case the actual frame. We will create an instance of the frame and apply an intersection boolean to it in the shape of the side plate's edges. This instance is important, so the side plate receives the changes too in case we edit the base frame. In the side plate, we can actually drive the curves of the mesh with a bevel modifier, since they are pretty simple. This way, we preserve the editability and versatility of the mesh. We will use the boolean as a subtraction operand in the base frame to leave room for the side plate. Then, we will use it to create the intersection boolean that will conform the actual side plate mesh. Our final showcase piece is the hammer. This is a rotating part, just like the trigger, so first things first. We need to locate the rotation point and use it as the center of a circle that will drive the curvature of the piece. Ignoring this will make it look uneven and poorly made when it's animated. Using the circle as a starting point, we match the rest of the hammer silhouette. We don't need to be exact with the bottom parts of it, since they will likely never be seen, and the more simple we make them, the more geometry we will save on the final low poly. The hammer is also a special piece because the frame will need to account for its different positions. When fully forward, its nose should be pressing on the bullet's primer, which trigger its explosion. As well, when cocked all the way back, its geometry should not clip with the frame. We will now set up a quick hammer animation to make sure these conditions are met, while modeling the nose and its connection points to the frame. With the nose set up, we make sure its length is adequate by checking the blueprint. Finally, we will also need a bit of room in the frame to make sure the nose can freely move back and forth without clipping. And that's it, our base mesh is done.